Imagine spending your entire life writing about the scandals, hypocrisies, and secret affairs of high society, only to discover that you've become the most scandalous story of all. That's Edith Wharton in a nutshell, the woman who documented every sin of the Gilded Age elite while simultaneously committing most of them herself. Tonight, we're talking about a writer who won the Pulitzer Prize, scandalized New York society, had a torrid affair with a journalist who was basically a walking red flag, and divorced her mentally ill husband after he embezzled her money to fund his mistress's lifestyle. And that's just the highlight reel. Edith Wharton was born into wealth, married into misery, escaped into literature, and spent her entire life trying to reconcile the person she was supposed to be with the person she actually was. She wrote novels about women trapped by society's expectations while being spectacularly trapped herself. She critiqued the moral bankruptcy of the upper class while living off an inheritance and building mansions. She was brilliant, contradictory, passionate, and absolutely terrible at picking men. Her story isn't just about a writer who chronicled the Gilded Age. It's about a woman who discovered that you can't write about passion without feeling it, can't critique society's cages without trying to escape your own, and can't expose everyone else's secrets without eventually becoming the subject of gossip yourself. So let's dive into the life of Edith Wharton, a woman who wrote the gossip and then, spectacularly, became it. Edith Newbold Jones was born on January 24, 1862, in New York City, into the kind of family that made other wealthy people feel poor. The Joneses were old money, the kind of establishment wealth that came from real estate, which in 19th century Manhattan was basically a license to print money. When people said keeping up with the Joneses, they might have literally been talking about Edith's family. That's both impressive and a little bit insufferable. New York in the 1860s was a city of stark contrasts, as if Instagram and reality had a baby, and the baby inherited all of Instagram's aesthetic, but reality's brutal honesty. You had massive mansions on Fifth Avenue, where people ate 7-course dinners on gold plates, and just blocks away, tenements where entire families lived in single rooms. Edith grew up firmly on the gold plate side of this divide, which gave her a front-row seat to wealth's absurdities and contradictions. Her childhood was privileged in every material sense, but emotionally complicated in ways that would take decades of therapy to unpack, if therapy had been a thing in the 1870s. Her mother, Lucretia Jones, was the kind of society matriarch who made the women in succession look warm and fuzzy. She was cold, critical, and deeply invested in maintaining appearances. She raised Edith to be ornamental, accomplished in all the ways that mattered to society, and useless in all the ways that mattered to actual life. Young Edith, however, had other ideas. She was intellectually voracious, the kind of child who would rather read than do literally anything else. She taught herself to read at age 4 and started making up stories before she could even write them down. She called this making up, which is adorable and also a little heartbreaking, because it suggests that even as a child, she understood that her imagination was something she had to create in secret, away from disapproving eyes. Her mother did not approve of this literary obsession at all. In the world of Gilded Age high society, women were supposed to be decorative, not creative. They could paint watercolors and play piano badly, but serious intellectual pursuits were considered vulgar, masculine, and worst of all, unnecessary. Why would a wealthy girl need to write? She was going to marry well and produce heirs, not novels. But Edith couldn't stop. She was like someone who'd discovered coffee and was trying to explain its importance to people who'd never been tired. She read everything she could get her hands on. Her father's library, books borrowed from friends, anything that would feed her growing understanding that the world was bigger and more complex than the narrow slice she'd been born into. The world outside her window was changing too. This was the Gilded Age, a term coined by Mark Twain to describe an era that looked golden on the surface, but was deeply corroded underneath. It was a time of massive wealth accumulation, industrial expansion, and social transformation. Robber barons were building empires. immigrants were pouring into cities, and the gap between rich and poor was widening into a chasm. The society Edith was born into was essentially playing Titanic violins, while the world around them shifted and cracked. Edith watched all of this with the keen eye of someone who was inside the system, but increasingly uncomfortable with it. She saw how marriages were arranged like business deals, how women were traded like valuable commodities, how everyone was performing respectability while conducting affairs, gambling fortunes, and generally behaving like terrible people behind closed doors. It was all very hypocritical, very false, and exactly the kind of material that makes for great literature. At 23, after years of being groomed for a suitable marriage, Edith finally got one. On April 29, 1885, she married Edward Robbins Wharton, known as Teddy, at Trinity Chapel in Manhattan. Teddy was 12 years older, came from a proper Boston family, and seemed like a safe choice. He was a sportsman, a gentleman, and someone who shared her love of travel and dogs. What he didn't share was her intellectual curiosity, her creative ambition, or apparently any real interest in physical intimacy. The marriage was doomed from the start, though it would take Edith 28 years to officially acknowledge this fact. Their sex life ended within weeks of the wedding, which in retrospect should have been a massive red flag, but was probably just chalked up to how marriages work in an era when women received approximately zero education about sex before their wedding night. Teddy, it turns out, wasn't interested in being a husband in any meaningful sense. He was interested in traveling, managing Edith's money, and living the life of a gentleman of leisure, which is Victorian speak for professionally unemployed. What no one talked about openly, but everyone noticed, was that the Whartons never had children. In Gilded Age society, this was more than just unfortunate. It was practically a scandal in itself. A woman's primary purpose, particularly a woman from Edith's class, was to produce heirs, preferably sons, but honestly any child would do as proof that the marriage was functioning as intended. The Whartons' childlessness became a subject of whispered speculation. Was she barren? Was he incapable? Were they so incompatible that they couldn't even manage the basic biological imperative that society expected of them? The truth, as always, was more complicated and more depressing than the gossip. Their sex life, such as it was, ended within weeks of their wedding. This wasn't unusual for the era. Victorian attitudes towards sex were so repressed that many couples struggled with intimacy. But it was particularly catastrophic for Edith and Teddy. They were essentially roommates who shared a last name and occasionally travelled together. The physical intimacy that might have created some bond between them, or at least resulted in children who could have given their marriage purpose, simply didn't exist. For Edith, this must have been bewildering and deeply lonely. She'd been given no education about sex before marriage, as was typical for women of her class. The whole subject was considered too vulgar for well-bred young ladies, so most went to their wedding nights with approximately zero knowledge of what was supposed to happen. Imagine going into the most intimate relationship of your life with no instruction manual, no guidance, and a partner who was equally clueless or, in Teddy's case, apparently uninterested. The lack of children meant that Edith had no biological excuse for her existence, at least not in society's eyes. She couldn't claim the identity of mother, which was the one role that would have made all her other ambitions socially acceptable. Wealthy women were expected to be ornamental and reproductive. Edith was only managing the ornamental part, and she was increasingly terrible at that too, what with all the writing and intellectual pursuits. But here's the twist. Not having children probably saved Edith's literary career. Think about it. If she'd had 3 or 4 children, which would have been typical for her class and era, she would have spent her 20s and 30s pregnant or recovering from pregnancy, managing nurseries, overseeing governesses, and performing all the duties of an upper-class mother. Writing would have been relegated to stolen moments, if she'd had the energy for it at all. Many talented women of her generation disappeared into motherhood and never emerged. Edith, freed from this particular obligation by her dysfunctional marriage, had time. She could travel extensively with Teddy, spending months in Europe absorbing culture and architecture. She could devote hours to her writing without interruption. She could build a literary career because she didn't have to build a nursery. It's a dark irony that one of the worst aspects of her marriage, the complete lack of physical intimacy, was also what allowed her to become Edith Wharton, literary icon, rather than just Mrs. Edward Wharton, society matron and mother of the Wharton children. Still, childlessness must have hurt, not because Edith necessarily yearned for motherhood. There's no evidence that she did, but because it was yet another way she failed to meet expectations, another way she was visibly, publicly not succeeding at being the woman she was supposed to be. Her mother probably had opinions. Society certainly did. And Teddy's family, watching their family line fail to extend through this branch, must have been disappointed. The relationship between Edith and Teddy was, by all accounts, more like that of caretaker and patient than husband and wife, and this dynamic only worsened as Teddy's mental health declined. He had chronic depression starting in the late 1880s, and by 1902, he was showing significant signs of mental illness. Edith spent years essentially managing an unwell spouse, a role that was exhausting and thankless, and left her feeling more like a nurse than a... Teddy, for his part, seems to have been content to live off Edith's inheritance and later her literary earnings, travelling when his health allowed it, and generally existing as a gentleman of leisure. He had no intellectual pursuits, no career, no particular ambitions beyond maintaining his lifestyle. When Edith became successful as a writer, Teddy's contribution to her career was to remark that it was amazing that someone so slim-waisted should also possess literary talent, which is the kind of backhanded compliment that makes you want to throw a book at someone's head. He couldn't understand her work, couldn't appreciate her success, and increasingly couldn't function as a partner in any meaningful sense. The fact that they had no children meant there was nothing binding them together except habit, social expectation, and the crushing weight of what divorce would mean for both their reputations. So they stayed married, two people living parallel lives that occasionally intersected for travel or social obligations. No children to raise, no intimacy to sustain them, no real partnership to speak of. Just two people trapped in a contract neither of them wanted, but neither knew how to escape. At least, not yet. But here's the thing about Edith. She was too smart, too ambitious, and too hungry for life to settle into quiet desperation. So she did what writers have always done when reality disappoints them. She created a better world on the page. By day, Edith Wharton was Mrs. Edward Wharton, a respectable society wife who hosted dinners, decorated homes, and travelled extensively with her husband. By night, she was something far more dangerous. A woman with a pen, a fierce intelligence, and a growing understanding that her life was a cage decorated with expensive wallpaper. She started writing in earnest in her late 20s, which by Gilded Age standards made her practically ancient for a debut. Her first published work was poetry, sent tentatively to magazines like Scribner's and Harper's. In 1889, Scribner published The Last Giustiniani, and Edith tasted the addictive drug of seeing her words in print. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of the life she'd been assigned. Her early stories drew from her own experiences, thinly veiled critiques of marriage, society, and the suffocating expectations placed on women. She wrote The Fullness of Life in the early 1890s, a story that was so obviously about her own marriage that her editor criticized it. But Edith refused to change it because, honestly, what was the point of writing if you couldn't tell the truth? The story speaks volumes about her relationship with Teddy, empty, unfulfilling, and increasingly unbearable. Fiction became her mirror, her therapy, and her weapon. She used her writing to confront all the unspoken truths of her world, that marriages were business arrangements, that women were property, that respectability was a performance everyone was exhausted from maintaining. Her characters struggled with the same questions she did. How do you live authentically in a world that demands artifice? How do you choose between security and happiness? What happens when you realize that the life you were promised is a beautiful lie? In 1897, she published The Decoration of Houses with architect Ogden Codman Jr. a book about interior design that was also, subtly, about creating spaces of beauty and order when your inner life felt chaotic and disordered. The book was a success, proving that Edith had a talent for making the domestic interesting, which is harder than it sounds. But her real breakthrough came in 1905 with The House of Mirth, a novel about Lily Bart, a beautiful woman destroyed by the very society that should have protected her. The book was a sensation. It sold 140,000 copies in the first 3 months, which in 1905 was basically the equivalent of going viral. Everyone was reading it, talking about it, and most importantly, recognizing themselves in it. High society was not amused. The book was too close to home, too honest about the cruelties and calculations of their world. Edith's social circle began to distance themselves from her, which must have stung, but also probably felt a little bit liberating. She'd written the truth, and the truth had made her both famous and infamous. Her literary star was rising just as her marriage was collapsing. Teddy was increasingly unstable, suffering from what we'd now recognize as bipolar disorder, but what was then vaguely called nerves or melancholy. His father had been institutionalized for years, possibly dying by suicide, so mental illness ran in the family like a dark inheritance. Teddy was depressed, erratic, and becoming harder to live with. And Edith? Edith was discovering that success in one area of life makes you uncomfortably aware of failure in others. She was wealthy, famous, accomplished, and deeply, profoundly lonely. In 1907, at the age of 45, Edith Wharton met a man who would change everything. His name was Morton Fullerton, and he was exactly the kind of person you should never, ever fall in love with if you value your peace of mind. Henry James, Edith's close friend and literary idol, made the introduction. Fullerton was a journalist for the London Times, based in Paris, and he moved in sophisticated intellectual circles. He was charming, well-read, and had the kind of dangerous charisma that makes smart people do stupid things. Edith was immediately intrigued. What she didn't know, or perhaps willfully ignored, was that Morton Fullerton was a walking disaster. He was bisexual in an era when that was scandalous, promiscuous in a way that would make modern people blush, and had a pattern of seducing successful, powerful people, and then disappearing without explanation. He'd had affairs with both men and women, was engaged to his own half-cousin, yes really, but kept postponing the wedding, and was living with an older French woman named Madame Mirecourt while simultaneously owing her money and being blackmailed by her. He was basically if all the red flags in the world got together and formed a person. But Edith, who had spent decades in a sexless marriage, who had never experienced real passion, who had written about love without truly feeling it, fell completely, desperately, embarrassingly in love with him. Their affair began in 1908, and for Edith, it was a revelation. For the first time in her life, at 46 years old, she experienced sexual desire and fulfillment. She felt seen, understood, desired for her mind as much as her body. She wrote him passionate letters, the kind that would make modern romance novels look tame. She poured everything into him, her longing, her intelligence, her hope that maybe, finally, she'd found someone who understood her. Fullerton, for his part, seems to have enjoyed the affair, but never took it as seriously as Edith did. He was drawn to power and success, and Edith was both successful and wealthy, which made her attractive. But commitment, emotional availability, those weren't really his thing. His MO was to seduce, enjoy, and then vanish, and that's exactly what he eventually did. The affair was conducted in hotel rooms across Europe. They met in Paris, in London at the Charing Cross Hotel, in various romantic locations that felt stolen and secret, and therefore even more intoxicating. Edith was experiencing things she'd only written about: passion, risk, the thrill of being wanted. She was also experiencing things she'd never written about: anxiety, obsession, the particular agony of loving someone who won't love you back with the same intensity. When Fullerton started to pull away, Edith became desperate. She wrote increasingly emotional letters, asking what she'd done wrong, begging for explanations. At one point, she actually enlisted Henry James to find out what had happened to Morton, which must have been mortifying for everyone involved. Imagine having to ask your friend to track down your lover because he's ghosting you. The 1900s had the same relationship problems as today, just with slower mail delivery. In her letters, Edith's pain is palpable. She writes about how she's borne his inconsistencies and incoherences because she loves him, how she's never been capricious or demanding, how she accepted him as he was. But she also writes with the dawning realization that he doesn't feel the same way, that what was transformative for her was merely pleasant for him. The affair ended around 1910, not with any dramatic confrontation, but with Morton simply fading away, becoming less available, less responsive, until Edith finally understood that it was over. She begged him to destroy her letters to avoid scandal, to protect her reputation. He promised he would. He kept every single one. Those letters weren't published until 1988, decades after both of them were dead, but their discovery confirmed what had long been suspected. Edith Wharton, the chronicler of society's hypocrisies, had conducted an extramarital affair with a man half of New York suspected was morally bankrupt. The gossip she'd written about had become her own story. But here's the thing about heartbreak. It can destroy you, or it can make you create something extraordinary. Edith chose the latter. In 1910, reeling from the end of her affair with Morton Fullerton and trapped in an increasingly untenable marriage, Edith Wharton began writing Ethan Frome. It's a bleak, brutal story about a man trapped in a loveless marriage, desperate for escape, and ultimately destroyed by his own choices. Literary scholars have long noted that it's essentially Edith's autobiography, with the genders scrambled and the setting moved to rural Massachusetts. Ethan Frome is Edith, trapped, yearning, suffocating. His invalid wife Zena is Teddy, sick, demanding, impossible to leave without looking like a monster. And Mattie Silver, the woman Ethan loves but can't have, is Morton Fullerton, the promise of something better that ultimately leads to disaster. The novel is Edith working through her pain, the only way she knew how, by writing it down and changing the names. While she was finishing Ethan Frome, her life was imploding in spectacular fashion. Teddy's mental health had deteriorated to the point where he could no longer function. But the real breaking point came when Edith discovered something that made his infidelity seem almost quaint. He'd embezzled nearly $50,000 from her trust fund, about $1.5 million in today's money, to set up his mistress in a fancy Boston apartment and entertain chorus girls. Let that sink in. While Edith was experiencing her first real sexual relationship at age 46 with a man who treated her terribly, her husband was stealing her money to fund his own much less emotionally complicated affair. The irony was not lost on anyone, least of all Edith. This was the final straw. In 1911, Edith made a decision that was scandalous for the time. She decided to divorce Teddy. In her social circle, divorce was unthinkable, the kind of thing that ruined reputations and got you quietly removed from guest lists. But Edith was done caring what people thought. Her husband had stolen from her, cheated on her, and was mentally unstable in ways that made daily life impossible. She gave him the Mount, her beloved home in Lenox, Massachusetts, in exchange for her freedom. By the time her boat arrived in France, the house had been sold. She moved to Paris permanently in 1913 and finally divorced Teddy after 28 years of marriage. She was 51 years old and starting over. In 1920, Edith published The Age of Innocence, her masterpiece. It's a novel about Newland Archer, a lawyer trapped by duty and convention who falls in love with the Countess Olenska, his wife's scandalous cousin. They conduct an emotional affair but never quite consummate it, bound by society's expectations even as their hearts break. It's beautiful, tragic, and absolutely about Edith's relationship with Morton Fullerton, except this time she gave them the dignity of restraint instead of the messiness of reality. In 1921, she won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, becoming the first woman ever to receive the award. It was a massive achievement, recognition from the literary establishment that she was one of the greatest writers of her generation. She'd done it. She'd broken free from her miserable marriage, rebuilt her life in France, and achieved the kind of success that most writers only dream about. And yet, when asked about it later, she described feeling a sharp, quiet ache. Success couldn't fill the void left by her failed relationships, couldn't erase the years of unhappiness, couldn't give her back the time she'd wasted on men who didn't deserve her. Teddy, for his part, never understood what he'd lost. He spent his final years living off his family's money, never comprehending that his wife had been one of the greatest literary talents of the century. He died in 1928, never having remarried, never having done anything of note except be the footnote in Edith Wharton's story. Edith made the decision never to remarry. She'd tried marriage once, and it had been a disaster. Why repeat the experiment? She had her work, her friends, her homes in France. She had Walter van Rensselaer-Berry, her longtime companion and possibly the real love of her life, though their relationship remained frustratingly ambiguous. Berry was the man she'd met at 21, the one who'd left without proposing, and who'd remained in her life as a close friend and literary advisor. Some scholars believe he was the inspiration for Lawrence Selden in The House of Mirth and Newland Archer in The Age of Innocence. The man who understood her intellectually but couldn't or wouldn't commit. During World War I, Edith threw herself into humanitarian work with the same intensity she brought to everything else. She organized relief efforts for Belgian refugees, set up sewing workshops to provide employment, and even traveled to the front lines to write dispatches. The French government awarded her the Legion of Honor in 1917 because apparently she couldn't just be excellent at one thing, she had to be excellent at everything. She continued to write, producing novels, short stories, and essays at a prolific rate. But her later works never quite captured the public imagination the way The House of Mirth and The Age of Innocence had. The world was changing. Modernism was taking over literature, and Edith's carefully structured novels about Gilded Age society began to seem old-fashioned. Writers like Hemingway and Fitzgerald were the new literary stars, and Edith was increasingly seen as a relic of a bygone era. She didn't seem to mind terribly. She'd spent her entire life writing about a world that was disappearing, documenting the death of an era even as she lived through it. If her work was now seen as historical rather than contemporary, well, that was fitting. She'd always been writing obituaries for the world she'd been born into. One of the persistent legends about Edith Wharton is that she haunted the Mount even after she'd left it. Staff and visitors reported feeling a presence, particularly near her third-floor writing room, and oddly, her bathroom window. Edith herself had written ghost stories and admitted to having felt some ghost presence while working in her study, though she attributed this to her childhood fear of the dark or her imagination as a writer. But the idea that she couldn't quite leave the home where she'd been briefly happy has a poetic resonance that's hard to dismiss. The real haunting, though, wasn't supernatural. It was the letters. In 1988, decades after Edith's death, Morton Fullerton's archive was finally opened to scholars. Despite his promise to destroy Edith's letters to protect her reputation, he'd kept every single one. The letters revealed the full extent of their affair, the passion, the desperation, the sexual awakening of a woman who'd spent 46 years not knowing what she'd been missing. They were intimate, vulnerable, and exactly the kind of scandal that Edith had feared. But by then, everyone involved was long dead, and the scandal couldn't hurt anyone anymore. If anything, the letters made Edith more sympathetic, more human. Readers discovered that the woman who'd written with such precision about trapped, yearning women had herself been trapped and yearning. The gossip she'd written about so brilliantly had been her own experience, just slightly fictionalized and infinitely better crafted. The revelation sparked renewed interest in Edith's work and life. Biographers pored over the letters, literary scholars reread her novels with new understanding, and readers discovered that The Age of Innocence and Ethan Frome weren't just brilliant observations of society. They were desperate attempts by a woman to make sense of her own heartbreak. There's something fitting about the fact that Edith's secrets were revealed through letters, through writing. She'd spent her entire life using words to expose truth, to peel back the veneer of respectability, and show the messy humanity underneath. That her own messy humanity was eventually exposed through her words seems almost inevitable. The letters also revealed another layer to her relationship with Fullerton. He wasn't just a charming cad. He was a genuinely complicated person with his own demons. His bisexuality, his financial troubles, his pattern of using people. All of this painted a picture of someone who was damaged and damaging in equal measure. Edith had fallen in love with a man who was incapable of giving her what she needed, and she'd known it even as she couldn't stop herself. In some of her letters, you can see her awareness of this tragedy. She writes about accepting him as he is, about not demanding more than he can give, about trying to be content with whatever scraps of affection he offers. It's heartbreaking to read because she's clearly trying to convince herself that this is enough, that she can be satisfied with being one of many people in his life, rather than the central figure in someone's world. Late in her life, Edith wrote a letter to Morton Fullerton that she never sent. It's not clear when exactly she wrote it or why she kept it, but its existence suggests that even decades after the affair ended, she was still processing what it meant. In the letter, she reflects on their relationship with the clarity that only time and distance can provide. She acknowledges that she loved him more than he loved her, that she demanded more than he could give, that they were fundamentally mismatched. But she also thanks him, because without him, she never would have known what passion felt like. She never would have written some of her best work. She never would have understood the characters she created with such empathy and precision. There's a theory that Edith understood herself better through her writing than through her life. That the novels were where she could be honest, where she could explore emotions and situations without the constraints of respectability. Her characters could do things she couldn't, say things she wouldn't, and through them, she could tell her own story without quite telling it. In The Age of Innocence, there's a line that feels like Edith speaking directly to us. It was the old New York way of taking life without effusion of blood, the way of people who dreaded scandal more than disease, who placed decency above courage, and who considered that nothing was more ill-bred than scenes, except the behavior of those who gave rise to them. She was writing about a world that valued appearances over authenticity, that would rather suffer in silence than cause a scene. And she was both critiquing that world and admitting that she was part of it, that she'd internalized its values, even as she rebelled against them. Toward the end of her life, a young journalist reportedly visited Edith at her home in France. The journalist asked about a specific line in one of her novels, whether it was based on real experience. Edith, who had spent decades being cagey about her personal life, deflecting questions about her marriage and her affairs, reportedly looked at the young woman and said simply, "Yes, it was real. It was real. All of it. The yearning, the betrayal, the impossible choices, the love that couldn't be sustained, the marriages that were cages, the society that crushed anyone who tried to live authentically. She hadn't just observed it, she'd lived it." Edith came to understand herself as a witness. She'd been born into a drowning world, a social order that was already obsolete even as it pretended to be eternal. She'd documented its death with precision and compassion, showing both its cruelties and its strange, flawed beauty. Her novels were time capsules, preserving a moment in American history when everything was changing and no one wanted to admit it. But she was more than just a chronicler. She was also a participant, someone who'd tried to navigate the impossible expectations placed on women of her class. She'd failed in some ways. Her marriage was a disaster. Her affair with Fullerton ended badly. She never quite escaped the constraints of her upbringing. But she'd succeeded in the ways that mattered most. She'd told the truth. She'd created art. She'd lived on her own terms even when it cost her. On August 11th, 1937, Edith Wharton died at her home in Saint-Brice-sous-Forêt, France. She was 75 years old and had suffered a stroke. She was buried in the American cemetery at Versailles, far from the New York society that had shaped her and that she'd spent her life writing about. Her death was noted in the newspapers, but didn't make major headlines. The world was gearing up for another war, and an elderly American writer dying in France wasn't particularly newsworthy. Some obituaries praised her work, others dismissed her as a relic of a bygone era. The literary world had moved on, and Edith Wharton was already being forgotten. For several decades, her reputation languished. Her books went out of print. Her name became a footnote in literary history, mentioned primarily in relation to Henry James, or as an example of Gilded Age literature. The modernists who'd taken over American literature had no patience for her careful prose, her social observations, her interest in manners and morality. She seemed hopelessly old-fashioned, too concerned with propriety, not experimental enough. But then, something interesting happened. In the 1960s and 70s, as feminist literary criticism emerged, scholars began to look at Edith Wharton with fresh eyes. They saw not a stuffy chronicler of high society, but a sharp critic of the patriarchal structures that oppressed women. They recognized that her novels about trapped women weren't endorsements of that trapping, but searing indictments of it. Her books were republished. Biographers dug into her life, uncovered the affair with Fullerton, and revealed the full extent of her unhappy marriage. The discovery of her passionate letters in 1988 cemented her reputation as someone who'd lived as intensely as she'd written. She wasn't a prim Victorian. She was a woman who'd risked everything for passion and paid the price for it. Modern readers found in Edith Wharton someone who spoke to contemporary concerns. Her novels about women trying to survive in systems designed to destroy them resonated with people navigating their own impossible circumstances. Her precise dissection of how society polices behavior, especially women's behavior, felt startlingly current. The specific details of her world, the calling cards, the rigid social hierarchies, the elaborate rules about what you could and couldn't do, might be gone, but the underlying dynamics of power, gender, and control remain depressingly familiar. The Age of Innocence and The House of Mirth are now considered masterpieces of American literature. They're taught in universities, adapted into films, read by people who've never heard of the Gilded Age but recognize the emotional truths at their core. Edith Wharton is no longer a forgotten relic. She's a literary icon, someone whose work transcends its historical moment to speak to universal human experiences. But her legacy is complicated, as it should be. She was enormously privileged, and she never quite escaped or rejected that privilege. She lived off inherited wealth while critiquing the society that created it. She employed servants and lived in mansions while writing about the constraints placed on women, seemingly unaware of or unconcerned with the constraints placed on women of other classes. She was progressive in some ways, her criticism of marriage, her advocacy for women's education, her belief that women deserved full lives, but deeply conservative in others. The controversy over her treatment by biographers and critics continues. Was she a feminist icon who fought against patriarchal constraints, or was she a privileged woman who benefited from systems of oppression while complaining about her gilded cage? Was her affair with Fullerton an act of liberation, or a desperate attempt to feel something in a life that had left her emotionally numb? Was she a victim of her era's expectations, or someone who could have made different choices but didn't? The answer, frustratingly, is probably all of the above. Edith Wharton was complicated, contradictory, and fully human. She was brilliant and petty, courageous and constrained, liberated and trapped. She wrote the gossip about her world with devastating accuracy, and then she became the gossip herself, providing future generations with the kind of scandal she'd spent her career documenting. So why does Edith Wharton's story matter, beyond being a juicy tale of affairs, embezzlement, and literary success? Because it reminds us that you can't write about life without living it. Edith spent decades observing society from a safe distance, documenting its hypocrisies without risking anything herself. But the work that made her immortal, The Age of Innocence, Ethan Frome, even the House of Mirth, came from places of personal pain and experience. She had to feel passion to write about it convincingly. She had to experience heartbreak to understand it. She had to risk scandal to critique society's fear of scandal. Her story matters because it shows that respectability is often just another word for silence, and silence is a kind of death. The world wanted Edith to be a proper society wife, to accept her loveless marriage, to write pretty poems and keep her opinions to herself. Instead, she wrote novels that exposed everything her world wanted hidden. She had an affair that scandalized her circle. She divorced her husband when divorce was unthinkable. She lived on her own terms, even when those terms were messy and complicated, and made her the subject of exactly the kind of gossip she'd spent her career writing about. It matters because she proved that you can't escape your contradictions. You can only try to understand them. Edith was both oppressor and oppressed, both privileged and trapped, both brilliant and blind to her own limitations. She never resolved these contradictions, and maybe that's okay. Maybe the point isn't to achieve perfect consistency, but to grapple honestly with your own complicity in systems that harm everyone, including you. And finally, her story matters because it's a reminder that art comes from truth, even when truth is uncomfortable, scandalous, and deeply personal. Edith Wharton wrote the gossip of her era with precision and empathy, exposing the human cost of society's rigid expectations. And then she became that gossip herself, providing us with a story that's just as compelling as anything she wrote. She spent her life documenting a drowning world, and in the process, she revealed her own struggle to keep her head above. She was a witness, yes, but also a participant, someone who made mistakes and bad choices, and experienced profound joy and devastating loss. She was, in other words, human, spectacularly, messily, brilliantly human. Tonight, we remember Edith Wharton not just as the first woman to win the Pulitzer Prize for fiction, not just as a chronicler of the Gilded Age, but as someone who learned the hard way that you can't write about passion without feeling it, can't critique your society without also being shaped by it, and can't tell other people's secrets without eventually having to face your own. She wrote the gossip, and then she became one. And in doing both, she left us something far more valuable than scandal. She left us the truth. Good night, and may we all have the courage to tell our own stories, even when they make us the subject of gossip we'd rather avoid.